Alexandria Ocasio Cortez walked into the Senate carrying a $4.7 trillion plan and the confidence of someone who expected the room to bend around the force of her argument. But the problem with confidence in a budget hearing is that eventually somebody asks for the receipt. The Senate Budget Committee hearing on federal spending priorities was packed far beyond the usual crowd, the gallery full, staffers lined along the walls, cameras pointed toward the witness table, and Ocasio Cortez arrived with her binder centered in front of her and three staffers positioned behind her like a support structure for a presentation already rehearsed down to the last gesture. Across the dais, Senator John Kennedy sat with his jacket open, a cheap spiral-bound pocket notepad beside his water glass, the kind of notepad that looked almost ridiculous next to embossed folders, thick briefing books, and the machinery of Washington. Ocasio-Cortez adjusted the microphone even though it did not need adjusting, lifted her chin, and began exactly where she wanted the hearing to begin, not with appropriations tables, administrative flowcharts, or spending formulas, but with morality. Kennedy clicked his pen, looked down at the tiny notepad, and waited. "Chairman, members of the committee, I want to make something very clear at the start," she began, and from the first sentence the framing was obvious because she was not presenting the proposal as one policy choice among several, she was presenting it as a test of character. She said the plan was not a wish list and not a progressive fantasy, but a moral obligation, then moved immediately to the story of her grandmother in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, a 74-year-old woman living for 11 months without reliable electricity, heating water on a camping stove and going to sleep when the sun disappeared because the power system had failed her. It was an emotionally powerful story, and the room reacted accordingly, going quiet in the way political rooms go quiet when a human experience suddenly replaces columns of numbers and forces, everyone listening to picture a real person rather than a federal program. The story itself was not the weakness in the argument. The weakness was the way it was being used to carry a $4.7 trillion spending package across a gap that numbers had not yet crossed. Ocasio-Cortez had converted personal suffering into political leverage, and for several minutes the room was too polite to challenge the conversion rate. She leaned forward and told the committee that this was not really about budgets or line items, but about whether the member sitting before her believed Americans deserved to live in a country that functioned, a framing so broad that disagreement with her spending plan could now be presented as disagreement with functioning government itself. Then came the pressure point. If the answer was yes, she argued, $4.7 trillion should be viewed as a down payment, and if the answer was no, senators should say so publicly so their constituents could hear it. That was the moment the testimony stopped sounding like testimony and started sounding like instruction, because she was no longer simply laying out information for the committee to examine. She was defining the moral answer first and daring anyone in the room to reject it. Some people in the gallery clearly liked the move, some did not, but Kennedy did not react either way, and that restraint mattered because he was not trying to win the emotional exchange. He wrote one short line in the pocket notepad, put the pen down, and waited for the chairman to open the questioning. Several senators went first, including one who asked about implementation timelines, and Ocasio-Cortez answered fluently, confidently, and at greater length than the question required, the kind of polished answer that works best when nobody interrupts the structure. Then the chairman recognized John Kennedy, and the tone of the hearing changed almost immediately because Kennedy did not begin by attacking her climate policy, questioning her motives, or dismissing the story about her grandmother. He told her the story was moving, said he understood what hardship looked like because his own mother had lived a difficult life in Zachary, Louisiana, and then calmly returned to the number she had placed at the center of the hearing. She had told the committee that $4.7 trillion was a moral obligation and had challenged anyone who disagreed to say so publicly, Kennedy noted. So before he accepted the moral label she had prepared for dissenters, He wanted to know precisely what Americans were being asked to buy. Then he asked the question that cracked open the entire presentation. What does $4.7 trillion come out to per American household? Ocasio-Cortez immediately tried to challenge the framing, arguing that reducing the proposal to a per-household figure ignored implementation modeling, revenue offsets, projected returns, and the broader economic structure behind the bill. But Kennedy cut through the escape route before it could become another lecture. He was not asking whether she liked the question, whether the question captured every economic variable, or whether the number could be surrounded by enough context to make it look smaller. He was asking what the price tag looked like when translated from Washington language into family language. Over $36,000, Kennedy said, delivering the figure without theatrics, as though he were reading a line from a receipt rather than trying to manufacture a television moment. That number changed the atmosphere because $4.7 trillion is abstract enough to float above ordinary life, while $36,000 per household immediately starts competing with things people actually recognize, including trucks, tuition, mortgages, medical bills, savings, and years of labor. Kennedy's point was brutally simple. Before politicians tell voters that something is a bargain, they should be able to state clearly what the bargain costs. Ocasio-Cortez did not retreat. She countered with healthcare, saying that a year of cancer treatment without insurance could also cost $36,000 and accusing Republicans of repeatedly voting to repeal healthcare coverage, a sharp pivot designed to move the argument away from the cost of her bill and toward the cost of another political failure. Democrats in the room responded, and for a moment the momentum shifted back in her direction because the rebuttal was emotionally recognizable and politically familiar. Kennedy refused to chase it, saying that nobody in the hearing wanted people to go without health care, but reminding her that the legislation before them was not a health care bill and that most of its money did not go anywhere near a hospital. That was the first real dividing line of the hearing. Ocasio-Cortez kept expanding the moral frame whenever a number became uncomfortable, while Kennedy kept shrinking the discussion back down to the receipt. His first lesson was therefore not ideological, complicated, or glamorous at all. Know what you are buying before you tell the people paying for it that they got a bargain. Ocasio-Cortez regrouped quickly because retreat was not part of the persona she had brought into the room, and after the first clean hit on cost, she reached for the argument that had served her well in rallies, interviews, and congressional exchanges: lived experience as authority. She reminded Kennedy that she had not grown up wealthy, that before Congress she had worked as a waitress and bartender in the Bronx, that she knew what it meant to check a bank balance before buying groceries, and understood the pressure of rent in a way Washington abstractions often ignore. The point was familiar and effective because it invited the audience to judge credibility not only by economic expertise but by proximity to ordinary struggle, and in many political settings that move is enough to shift the burden back onto the person asking the question. She accused Kennedy of reducing a massive investment in working families to arithmetic on a cheap notepad, suggesting that making the math sound frightening was simply another way for Washington to convince people to stop asking for what they deserved. The cameras loved the turn because this was Ocasio-Cortez back on familiar ground, speaking not to the committee as much as through the committee to everyone watching. Kennedy did not challenge the dignity of bartending because he did not need to, and that restraint made his response sharper than a personal attack would have been. He spoke about Zachary, Louisiana, about farmers, teachers, and people who repaired their own trucks because mechanics cost money they did not have, then drew the distinction Ocasio-Cortez had not expected him to emphasize. After she finished bartending, he said, she went to Congress and began helping decide how public money should be spent, while after his own schooling, he went into the Louisiana State Treasury and spent 2 decades managing money that belonged to other people. The contrast was devastating precisely because it was not a claim that one occupation was morally superior to another. It was a claim that managing billions in public assets creates a kind of experience that personal financial struggle, however real, does not automatically provide. Ocasio-Cortez had put experience on the table as a credential, and Kennedy simply placed a different credential beside it and allowed the room to compare the weight. She tried to cut that comparison down by arguing that running a state treasury was not equivalent to managing the scale of a federal budget, dismissing Louisiana's finances as tiny next to what she was proposing, and comparing the difference to a lemonade stand versus a grocery chain. It was meant to diminish him, and she delivered it with the confidence of someone who believed she had finally found the right edge to turn the exchange back in her favor. Kennedy repeated the phrase, "a lemonade stand," slowly, not because he was offended, but because she had handed him a cleaner opening than anything he could have written for himself. He said he would remember the comparison the next time Louisiana retirees asked how their pension funds were being managed, because apparently their retirement money, bond portfolios, and state investments now qualified as the financial equivalent of children selling lemonade on a sidewalk. The room reacted before she did, because everyone could see that the insult had made his experience easier to explain rather than easier to dismiss. Kennedy then laid out what that supposedly trivial Treasury experience actually involved, including tracking down millions in unclaimed property and returning it to the people who owned it instead of allowing the money to disappear into bureaucracy. He reminded the room that he had sued 16 major banks over deceptive loan products sold to Louisiana families and had won those cases, and that he had spent years dealing with accounts where every dollar had an owner and every missing dollar required an explanation. The point was not that Treasury work made him infallible. The point was that years of managing other people's money teaches a habit Washington rhetoric often resists, the habit of following a dollar after it leaves the room. Politicians love announcing money because announcements come with microphones, applause, headlines, and ribbon cuttings. But the less glamorous question is what remains after that money passes through agencies, consultants, compliance offices, grant administrators, and programs built to supervise other programs. Kennedy's second lesson therefore landed with more force than the first. Talking about money and managing money are not the same profession, no matter how confidently somebody tries to blend them together. Ocasio-Cortez shifted again, this time toward statistics, because if moral argument and personal experience were not controlling the hearing, then data might. She cited the wealth of the top 1%, the cost of climate disasters, the infrastructure gap, and an asserted return of $1.80 for every dollar invested in green infrastructure, firing the figures rapidly enough to rebuild the image of someone holding the bigger economic picture. She then mocked Kennedy's reliance on arithmetic, telling him he could sit with his notepad doing long division while bridges failed and people drowned, and suggesting he replace the notepad with a calculator. It was the data version of the same lecture, the idea that the sophistication of the problem made his simpler questions almost childish, as though asking where money travels is somehow less serious than announcing how much society needs. Kennedy waited until she finished, because once again the advantage was not in speaking louder, but in narrowing the question. He took the $1.80 return claim and asked where the original dollar physically went after the federal government collected it, not what the brochure promised, not what a projection said it would eventually produce, but who received the first check. Ocasio-Cortez opened her binder for the first time, moved through prepared material, and began listing existing agencies including the Department of Energy, Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the new climate resilience structure contemplated by the legislation. Kennedy already knew the architecture, pointing to 14 agencies, 6 new interagency offices, a grant structure containing 4 levels of administrative review, and 217 programs before money reached the work being advertised to the public. The binder was prepared to defend purpose, scale, need, and projected benefit, but Kennedy was asking about plumbing, and policy language does not become more reassuring simply because the pages containing it are thicker. His question reduced the whole structure to something a household could understand. If the government takes $1, how much of that dollar survives the machinery built to distribute it? Kennedy described that dollar melting through the system, with portions consumed by administration, salaries, office costs, travel, consultants, and compliance before the promised benefit ever reached a worker or family. He gave the breakdown that ended with approximately 19 cents reaching the destination, and the room suddenly had a number much easier to understand than trillions in federal spending or multipliers projected across decades. Ocasio-Cortez objected that his breakdown was hypothetical and that the bill contained accountability measures, but Kennedy's answer was that government programs routinely carry the word accountability while still losing money, because labeling a pipe does not repair the leak. That was the central weakness he was exposing now. A program can be designed around a noble objective and still become wasteful in execution, and moral language cannot substitute for evidence that the delivery mechanism works. 19 cents did more damage to the presentation than another ideological argument could have done, because every taxpayer understands the insult of handing over $1 and discovering that most of it disappeared before reaching the purpose used to justify taking it. Then Kennedy moved from the hypothetical dispute to a concrete example from the source script, citing a 2021 Department of Energy Green Energy Workforce grant totaling $240 million and asking how many permanent jobs it produced. The answer he supplied was 314, which he translated into roughly $764,000 per job, turning another government-sized figure into something that could be compared with the cost of a house, a car, or years of wages. He argued that in Louisiana, a good 3-bedroom house could be bought for around $150,000, making the comparison deliberately brutal. The government had spent enough per job that it could have provided each worker with far more tangible value and still had money left. Ocasio-Cortez tried to contain the damage by insisting that one program could not be extrapolated across everything she was proposing, but Kennedy's immediate answer was the problem she did not want emphasized. Her bill contained 217 programs. By then, the pages of the binder had stopped functioning like armor, the number 19 cents was still sitting in the room, $764,000 per permanent job had joined it, and Ocasio-Cortez was preparing to do what politicians do when the arithmetic becomes a trap. Stop defending the plan and put the person asking the questions on trial instead. Ocasio-Cortez reached for the pivot exactly when Kennedy expected her to, abandoning the shrinking battlefield of program mechanics and forcing the argument outward toward Republican spending, national debt, tax cuts, and defense budgets where the numbers were larger and responsibility easier to distribute. She reminded him that the previous administration had added roughly $7.8 trillion to the national debt, accused Republicans of supporting tax cuts whose benefits overwhelmingly favored the top 1%, and pointed to a defense budget consuming hundreds of billions of dollars a year without the kind of clean audit record Washington endlessly demands from everybody else. It was a familiar maneuver because it changed the question from whether her proposal could justify its own cost into whether Kennedy and his party had any moral standing to criticize waste after supporting expensive policies themselves. In another hearing against another senator, the redirect might have worked because political arguments often survive by forcing everyone to defend their own side until nobody remembers what the original question was. Kennedy did remember, and more importantly, he refused to pretend that Republican waste became less wasteful simply because acknowledging it might weaken a partisan talking point. He conceded that some of her criticism could be fair and reminded her that he had voted against spending bills from his own party when he believed they were irresponsible, a response that deprived her of the clean partisan villain she needed. There was no long defense of every Republican vote, no attempt to pretend one party had discovered fiscal purity while the other had invented debt, because Kennedy understood that defending everything your own side does is one of the fastest ways to surrender credibility in a budget hearing. Then he closed the detour by returning to the central fact that they were not there to examine somebody else's bill, somebody else's administration, or somebody else's excuses. They were there because Ocasio Cortez had brought her proposal into the room and asked the committee to approve the spending. That distinction mattered because accountability collapses the moment every bad number can be answered with a worse number from the opposition, and under that logic, no program would ever have to justify itself as long as politicians could find an older mistake somewhere in Washington. Kennedy let her history lesson finish, accepted the parts he considered valid, and then told her that if she wanted to discuss history, they could discuss hers too. He turned to the supporting materials connected to the Green New Deal and asked whether she remembered the frequently asked questions page released by her office, a document she immediately characterized as a draft published in error by a staffer and quickly withdrawn. Kennedy focused on the phrase stating that economic security would be provided to people unwilling to work, emphasizing not those unable to work because of disability, illness, or circumstances beyond their control, but people described by the document itself as unwilling. The significance was not that one phrase could settle every argument about climate or welfare policy. The significance was that her office had once placed language into the public record that made the spending philosophy Kennedy was criticizing unusually easy to caricature. Ocasio-Cortez wanted the document treated as a mistake in process, while Kennedy treated it as evidence of the broader problem he had been pressing all afternoon. Ambitious promises are often written first and subjected to unforgiving financial questions later. The withdrawn FAQ therefore became less important as a document than as another example of what happens when moral ambition runs faster than scrutiny. Kennedy moved next to her 2019 warning that the world was going to end in 12 years if climate change was not addressed, reminding the room that 6 years had passed and delivering the point with the dry observation that the world and his cows in Louisiana were still there. He did not need to turn the line into a speech because exaggeration loses power fastest when somebody simply puts a date beside it and waits for everyone to remember how apocalyptic certainty sounded when first delivered. The larger point was credibility. Politicians who demand trillions in immediate spending while using catastrophic deadlines should expect those deadlines to be remembered later, especially if the same politician arrives at another hearing demanding another enormous financial commitment. Ocasio-Cortez had built much of her argument around urgency, and Kennedy was showing the committee that urgency itself could not be treated as proof because dramatic predictions do not become more accurate merely because they produce headlines. Once again, he was taking something designed to operate emotionally and forcing it into the less forgiving territory of dates, numbers, and outcomes. Then Kennedy moved from policy language to political symbolism, raising her appearance at the 35,000 per ticket Met Gala in the famous Tax the Rich dress, and using the image to attack the contradiction between elite political theater and lectures about inequality. He said he would not know what to wear to a $35,000 dinner party, but he knew enough not to attend one wearing a slogan about taxing wealthy people, and then appear before a Senate committee lecturing working Americans about sacrifice. The line cut because it condensed a broader criticism into one visual contradiction that required almost no explanation. A politician condemning concentrated wealth while standing inside one of the most exclusive social events in the country. Whether supporters considered the appearance activism or opponents considered it hypocrisy was almost beside Kennedy's tactical point, because in that room, he was not trying to settle the cultural debate around the Met Gala. He was attacking the credibility of a lecture. Ocasio-Cortez had spent the hearing speaking from a position of moral authority, and Kennedy was stripping away that advantage by showing the committee how easily moral symbolism can collide with the image surrounding it. From there, he returned to the Green New Deal and the huge price estimate attached to it in the source script, placing the figure at 93 trillion and stressing the word trillion because at that scale, ordinary intuition starts to fail. Then he reminded her of the Senate vote in which every Democratic senator voted present rather than supporting the proposal outright, a fact that allowed him to move from attacking Republican resistance to examining the behavior of her own political allies. His argument was mercilessly simple. If the plan was as obviously necessary, urgent, and morally defensible as its advocates claimed, then why did not one Democratic senator put a clean yes vote beside his or her name when the proposal reached the floor? Ocasio-Cortez responded that the vote had been a procedural maneuver engineered by Mitch McConnell to force Democrats into a politically impossible position, but Kennedy refused to let procedure erase the image of an entire caucus stepping away from the invoice. Present, in his framing, became the vote politicians use when they want the bumper sticker without accepting ownership of the bill attached to it. That was Kennedy's fourth lesson. When your own team will not put its name on your plan, procedural explanation does not completely erase the political message carried by the refusal. Ocasio-Cortez set down her water glass harder than she intended, the microphone catching the small thud, and for the first time, the physical confidence she had carried into the room looked less stable than the posture itself suggested. She had entered prepared for left versus right, progressive ambition versus conservative obstruction, compassion versus austerity, because those were ideological battlefields where she possessed an army of familiar arguments and a national audience already trained to recognize the sides. Kennedy had dragged the hearing somewhere much less comfortable, away from identity, motive, and ideological branding, and toward the primitive question that exists beneath every budget, regardless of party. What are you spending? Who pays? And what comes back? With the hearing reduced to that standard, the moral lecture was no longer enough. The bartending story was no longer enough. The statistics were no longer enough, and even the attack on Republican debt had failed to make her own numbers disappear. Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward again and attacked Kennedy's style itself, dismissing the folksy manner, the pocket notepad, and the one-liners as if reducing his method to performance could reduce the force of the unanswered questions attached to it. She told him this was not a comedy show, that real families were suffering, and that compressing $4.7 trillion in human need into arithmetic scribbled onto a cheap notebook revealed everything about his priorities. But the attack only gave Kennedy permission to make the distinction he had been building toward for the entire hearing. He placed the pen down, flattened both hands on the desk, and agreed with one point. This was not a comedy show. It was a budget hearing, and in a budget hearing, the decisive question is not how intensely somebody cares because everyone can claim compassion, but how much the proposal costs and who ultimately pays for it. He then began listing what she had failed to provide despite an hour of testimony, moving deliberately from the per household cost to the path of the dollar, from the first office receiving the check to the refusal of her own party to endorse the previous plan with a yes vote. The room had now reached the point Kennedy had been preparing for since the first line he wrote in the $2 notepad, because after every lecture, every pivot, every statistic, and every personal story had been exhausted, only one question remained, and this time there was nowhere else left to send it. Kennedy did not rush the ending because by then the hearing no longer needed speed, only accounting, and he began laying out the record exactly the way a man closes a ledger when every column has already been filled. He reminded Ocasio-Cortez that she had given him her grandmother, her bartending experience, statistics about wealth inequality, attacks on Republican spending, arguments about climate urgency, and lectures about morality, but none of those responses had answered the narrow questions he had asked. Each item landed separately because he was no longer debating the philosophy behind the bill. He was demonstrating how many times the conversation had moved away from the mechanics of the money whenever those mechanics became uncomfortable. The pattern was now impossible to ignore. When asked about cost, the answer became compassion. When asked about the path of the dollar, the answer became structural injustice. When asked about political support, the answer became procedure. When asked for a direct explanation, the answer became another lecture. Kennedy reduced the entire hour to one brutal observation. She had given the committee almost everything except the answer. Then he looked down at the pocket notepad, closed it, and placed it on the desk, turning the object she had mocked into the cleanest symbol of the hearing without adding another layer of performance. The little spiral-bound pad had never been impressive, expensive, or theatrical, but it had done what the binder had not done. It had kept track of the numbers being offered, the questions being avoided, and the distance between the promise and the accounting. Kennedy said the final lesson was not free because taxpayers were already paying for it through the money they sent to Washington, through the hours they worked to earn that money, and through the programs politicians expected them to fund on trust. He told her that people watching deserved an answer rather than another story, another lecture, or another declaration of good intentions, because taxpayers are not abstract units inside a congressional score. They are the people whose paychecks supply every grand program announced from behind a microphone. Then he asked the question he had been driving toward from the beginning: where does the money go? Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, moved toward the microphone, looked down at the binder, and found that weeks of prepared material had not produced a clean answer to a question simple enough to fit on a receipt. The binder contained talking points, projections, charts, agencies, goals, justifications, and explanations of why the country needed to act, but Kennedy had reduced all of that material to the journey of one taxpayer dollar after government took possession of it. She drew a breath, held it, released it, and for the first time in the hearing, there was no immediate pivot, no statistic fired back across the dais, no accusation strong enough to move the room somewhere else. Kennedy did not grin, interrupt, or use another one-liner, because doing so would have weakened the moment. He simply sat still with both hands beside the closed notepad and allowed the silence to answer for her. The silence mattered because after an hour dominated by words, the absence of them became the strongest evidence Kennedy had produced. The room had changed completely from the one Ocasio-Cortez entered, not because her passion had disappeared, but because passion was no longer the standard by which the proposal was being judged. Her hands, animated earlier as she pointed, opened her palms, and emphasized moral urgency, now rested flat on the closed binder while staffers behind her looked down instead of toward the cameras. The cameras remained on, recording a moment in which nothing dramatic had to happen because the contrast itself had become the story. One side had arrived, prepared to explain why trillions should be spent. The other had spent the hearing asking what happened after the spending began. Kennedy eventually put his pen in his shirt pocket and turned toward the chairman, signaling that he had nothing left to add, because once the question had been asked and not answered, repeating it would only dilute the point. Ocasio-Cortez later stood and left the hearing with her staff behind her, while the impression created by the final exchange remained in the room longer than any applause could have. What the hearing exposed was not simply a clash between two politicians or two parties, but a weakness in a political style that depends heavily on moral certainty and assumes that emotional force can carry the argument through the accounting stage. Ocasio-Cortez is effective in environments where intensity, personal experience, and ideological clarity are rewarded immediately, because rallies, town halls, and television segments often measure success by whether the audience feels convinced before the details are fully tested. A budget hearing works differently because the numbers do not become more cooperative when the speaker is charismatic. The administrative structure does not become cheaper when the goal is admirable, and a program does not become efficient simply because its purpose sounds humane. Kennedy understood that difference and never needed to prove that climate resilience, infrastructure, health, or working families were unworthy causes. He only needed to prove that worthy causes still require competent accounting. That is why his strongest weapon was not ideology, but reduction, taking every enormous claim and shrinking it until an ordinary taxpayer could see the price tag. The bartending argument failed for the same reason, because personal hardship can establish empathy, discipline, and familiarity with working class life, but it does not automatically establish expertise in managing public finances. Kennedy did not need to insult honest work to make that distinction. He only had to compare Ocasio-Cortez's claim of lived experience with his own 2 decades handling Treasury responsibilities, lawsuits against banks, pension funds, bonds, investments, and money that had identifiable owners. Once credentials became part of the argument, the room was allowed to judge what kind of experience was most relevant to the question being asked, and on the narrow issue of tracing public money, Kennedy's experience was simply closer to the job under examination. That was the deeper reason the lemonade stand insult backfired, because diminishing the scale of Louisiana's Treasury work did not erase the fact that managing smaller pools of real money is still more relevant to financial stewardship than speaking passionately about larger pools one has never personally administered. The hearing therefore turned experience from a shield into a comparison, and Ocasio-Cortez lost control of the comparison the moment she invited it. The same thing happened with the statistics, because large numbers can create authority only until somebody asks how they connect to execution, and Kennedy repeatedly dragged the argument from macroeconomic claims down into administrative detail. A projected return of $1.80 for every dollar sounds efficient until the committee asks who receives the first check, how many agencies touch the funding, how many offices supervise distribution, how much is consumed by consultants and compliance, and how much finally reaches the person whose need justified the program. The source script's 19-cent figure became powerful, not because it was rhetorically sophisticated, but because it translated bureaucratic waste into something every person understands immediately, handing over $1 and getting back a fraction while being congratulated for the transaction. The $240 million grant and 314 permanent jobs made the same point at another scale by forcing the audience to compare the announced objective with the implied cost per result. Kennedy's argument throughout was consistent. Good intentions do not become good management merely because the government prints them in the same document. That is ultimately why the final question carried more weight than all the ideological arguments that came before it, because where does the money go stripped the debate of slogans and forced it into a form any family would recognize. If somebody arrived at a kitchen table asking for an enormous amount of money, promised transformation, insisted that giving it was a moral duty, and then could not clearly explain where the money would travel after leaving the account, ordinary people would not call the unanswered details irrelevant. They would call them the reason not to sign the check, because trust becomes reckless. The moment scrutiny is treated as cruelty, and arithmetic is dismissed as an obstacle to compassion. Ocasio-Cortez came into the hearing prepared to prove that the country should want more, while Kennedy forced the committee to ask whether wanting more is enough when the person asking for the money cannot trace the dollar from the taxpayer to the promised result. The $2 notepad did not defeat a $4.7 trillion proposal by being clever. It defeated the lecture by insisting on the one standard the lecture could not escape, the standard every taxpayer eventually reaches when the slogans end, the bill arrives, and somebody finally asks where the money went.